Welcome to the Melton City Council's 2020 commemoration of Refugee Week, a day to raise awareness about the issues affecting people with refugee and asylum seeker background and celebrate the immense courage, resilience and valuable contributions they make to our society. The Melton City Council would usually host a number of events throughout the municipality during Refugee Week. However, this year, due to the current crisis, we will be hosting an online webinar to ensure we commemorate this occasion safely. My name is Fran Grossi and I'm the Intercultural Project Officer at Melton City Council, and I would like to introduce you to our host for today's session, Juanella Zimmer, an inspiring young student from Staunton College in Melton, and thank the wonderful Yvette Medina, Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Engagement Coordinator at Staunton College, for her support in developing this webinar. We are presenting today on behalf of the Melton City Council a webinar to engage and educate the people who live, work and study in the City of Melton. Today's webinar will focus on how we can learn from the refugee experience to guide us through uncertain times. I will now hand it over to Juanella to commence the session. Thank you, and we hope that you enjoy.
Hi, I'm Nyon Zimmer and I'm a Year 11 student from Staunton College. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather. For everybody, this will be different. However, today I stand on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects for the elders past, present, and emerging. I'm happy to be your host for today's session. As Fran mentioned, today's webinar is about how we can learn from the refugee experience to guide us through uncertain times. Today we will be hearing from the inspiring Fadak Al-Fidith, who will share her story, one of resilience, connection, and hope. I myself am an Australian who was born in Zambia, but my ethnicity is Burundian. My parents and I arrived in Australia in 2004 when I was 1 year old. The languages spoken in the country are English, French, Swahili, Kirundi, and Kinyarwanda. My family and I have been living in the Melton area for 3 years now. Part of my culture that I really like to keep alive is the traditional dancing. My cousins and I have decided to start our own dance group called Clubiteka. We wanted to represent the community in Melbourne since all the Australian states have one. We do both Burundian and Rwandan traditional dances. I think it's very important that we commemorate Refugee Week, and I'm really happy to be involved in this. We should listen to other people's stories, and since everyone's story is different, and hear how far they've come. It can be motivational and let us know that anyone can achieve anything in their life, no matter their background. As Nelson Mandela said, education is the most important weapon which you can use to change the world. So my hope today is that we all learn something from Fadak's story. Today's webinar is delivered to you in partnership with the Melton Interfaith Network. The Melton Interfaith Network's purpose is to develop harmony, cohesiveness, and tolerance in the City of Melton, to generate awareness for all faiths, beliefs, and traditions in the community, in order to promote understanding and harmony. I want to welcome Gary Verma, President of the Melton Interfaith Network, to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you very much, Juanella, for your wonderful introduction. Melton Interfaith Network, it was founded like 5-6 years ago, and we run many events to promote social cohesion and harmony with different faith groups, as mentioned by Juanella as well. Last year we had a wonderful year. Unfortunately, this year, because of this pandemic, COVID-19, we are not able to do many festivals or events in person. So we are trying to adopt as much as we can and help other communities by having online webinars like this. Last year we did many great events, and mainly we had Building Gender Equality and Respect Forum, which we attended along with the Melton City Council. We run many places of worship tours so that all the faiths and the community, they work together in harmony. So we ran tours to Al Imam College in Melton. We ran St. Anthony's Catholic Church. We went to Jewish Museum. We went to Hare Krishna Hindu Temple. We went to Islamic Museum and many Sikh temples across Victoria, and also the biggest Hindu temple in Victoria, Shri Durga Temple as well. So these places of worship tours always help to understand each other's faith, and more awareness and more respect. We also participated with the Melton City Council in Harmony Day celebrations. We always work with the council in partnership. We ran welcoming cities tour as well under the guidelines of Victorian government. We ran many iftar dinners for the last so many years. Every year we do iftar dinners. Unfortunately, this year we were not able to host a dinner due to COVID-19 pandemic. And I promise you, when things are improving, we will do many such dinners in future to cover up for the loss we had in the last few months. And we ran many community dinners for all the community members, irrespective of their race, their color, their faith, where they belongs to. And it was attended by more than 350 people on each occasion from different community members from Melton City Council. Yeah, and I had the opportunity and privilege to represent Melton Interfaith Network at many events hosted by City of Melton, as well as Wyndham City Council and Hobson Bay as well. And what we need to do is continue to look for more sources and get feedback from community so that we can continue to grow and be visible within the community and help more and more faith groups. We would also like to have more community members, young people like Fadak or Juanella and Ued to come on board as well and promote our message of community harmony and peace. I'd also like to thank Melton City Council officers and my community members from Melton Interfaith Network who have worked with me tirelessly during the last few years to make this happen. And as admin will continue to engage different faith groups with shared values and work to eliminate religious prejudice and barriers to create a multicultural society where all members live together in peace, harmony, and social cohesion. Once again, I would like to thank Melton City Council for organizing this wonderful Refugee Week event, which helps to inform public about the refugees and celebrate their positive contribution made by refugees to Australian society. And we're going to hear very soon from a beautiful and charming Fadak as well, how the contribution has been made and her story as well. And again, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay well, and always obey the social guidelines given by the local authorities. Thank you. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Gary Verma. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Fadak Al-Fadith. Fadak is a young Australian community lawyer, advocate for gender inequity, writer, and 15 years ago, a refugee from Iraq. Fadak started the Meet Fadak Speaking Tour, a campaign to highlight Australia's strength in diversity and to change the narrative about refugees and people seeking asylum in Australia. Fadak is someone who knows what it means to live life with uncertainty. An inspirational woman whose life was completely uprooted when she left her home country and made her journey to Australia. Fadak is a young, inspiring woman who has found ways to turn adversity into opportunity. There is so much that we can learn from her story today. From her resilience, solidarity, and kindness. I believe that she will be able to help our community through the current crisis that we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Juanella, for the beautiful introduction, and thank you, Gary, for your speech. And finally, thank you to Melton City Council and to the Interfaith Network for having me today. I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work on here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present and anyone who's watching this recording today. As a young person who came to Australia as a refugee and as a child who had no choice but to end up here, I often think about the communities who were displaced across different parts of Australia for some very, very long time, and especially now that we are in national within Refugee Week and not long ago had a National Reconciliation Week. It's important to think about that and remember it every time we meet. I want to start by telling my story of coming here as a child, and thank you again for having me. And I do want to talk about what we could learn from people seeking asylum during Refugee Week and during these difficult times that we are all experiencing in Australia, and some of us. Have been directly, all of us have been impacted, but some more than others. I remember coming to Australia in 2003 after the invasion of Iraq. I was 10 years old when the invasion happened in 2003, and we came to Australia thinking that it would only be a temporary solution for us and that we would one day be able to go back to Iraq because that's where we wanted to be, that's where our family was, and that's where we had plans for our whole lives. We never thought that we would want to stay in Australia forever. It was only a temporary solution. But as you would know, the political and safety situation in Iraq hasn't improved, but we've been lucky to be able to call Australia home. Since 2003. I remember having a really good life as a child and a really positive, happy childhood amongst my family in Baghdad in Iraq. My dad, his family were revolutionaries, so on multiple occasions attempted to topple the dictatorship in Iraq at the time, the Saddam Hussein government. So as a result of that, my dad one day had to actually escape from Iraq. So my dad was a surgeon in Iraq, and he was conscripted in Saddam Hussein's army. And if you're a doctor who joins the army, it would mean that you'd have to commit abhorrent acts like torture or covering up torture. So he obviously didn't want to be a part of that, and that went against all of his values. So my dad escaped Iraq in the late 90s, and he ended up in Australia. He came to Australia by boat, and he was detained for about a year before he was let out into the community. So that happened to me when I was about 5 years old, that I didn't see my dad for another 5 years when he escaped Iraq in the late 90s. And I remember that he actually took, in order to protect us from the regime and from the secret police that we had in Iraq at the time, he didn't tell us where he was, and he didn't tell us that he was leaving. So to us, he actually just disappeared out of nowhere. And we didn't know if he was alive or dead for a very long time, and we definitely didn't know where he was. But fast forward, to 2003, and even before that, although my dad wasn't living with us, I had a pretty good childhood otherwise. I remember just being surrounded by my big, beautiful family who, I loved going out and playing soccer with my cousins. And, as soon as I would get home from school, I would throw my bag on the floor and sometimes pretend that I'm doing my homework so that I could go outside and play soccer with the other kids in the neighborhood. I remember going to my grandmother's house and, walking into her house and just smelling the beautiful aromas of the food that she used to make and getting excited that I was going to see my several cousins. And I remember she used to make this sweet bread, like a round pancake that was really, really beautiful. And she used to make it for me and for my cousins. So every time we see her, we would beg her to make it for us. So I've always had really beautiful, positive memories of my hometown, and we never thought that we would be in a situation where we would have to leave. Despite my dad obviously having that experience, we actually were hoping and we were staying positive that he would eventually be able to come back to Iraq and that the situation would change politically. But obviously that didn't happen the way we hoped. My first memories of things changing for me and for my family were in late 2002 and early 2003, when the adults in my life started to talk about the Americans, and the Americans who were the Americans who were coming into Iraq. And, you know, at first it started just to be rumors. They were just saying, oh, you know, the Americans might come and, you know, they might do this and they might bring weapons. And, you know, it was just like talking that they talked about amongst themselves. But it slowly grew to be that they were really worried. And then that grew into them planning. So it does remind me of what happened with COVID-19 and with the crisis, because it started off as something really far away, and it slowly and gradually became something that impacted us. So I remember around late 2002 that my family started to prepare a house for the invasion. And I remember my mum, she bought, you know, bags of flour and rice and lentils, and, you know, we had big buckets of water that we filled up with water, and we prepared our house. We got some fuel to have around should there be shortages, and we even had a well of water dug into our front yard just in case, you know, there wasn't any access to water. So we did our best to prepare. And I also remember my mum putting sticky tape in crisscross motion all over the windows in our house, so that if they shatter and break when bombs were falling, they wouldn't cause injury to people in the house. And that's a really vivid memory that I have of her preparing the house. And what stood out to me was that my mum had been, you know, she was in her 30s at the time, and she had been through 3 different wars in her lifetime. So what struck me was that she knew how to prepare, and she was ready, and she understood what that would mean, which is a really, really scary thought, because I'm nearing my early 30s, and it's scary to think about, you know, having been through 3 different wars in the one lifetime. Look, after all that preparation, the first experience that I had of fear and of being really, really scared, it came around really suddenly. I remember one night when the bombs started to fall. So it was in March 2003, when it was during night time and the bombs started to fall on us. And it's really hard to describe, because I usually think of it, usually try and help people by imagining an earthquake, but most people haven't been through an earthquake either. So if you can think of a really loud noise, and then the house shaking all at the one time, and everything around in your house, like your bookshelves, your furniture, all shaking, and really, really loud, scary noise. That's how bombs felt like, and they went on for several nights in a row. And I remember just being with, you know, my mum brought me and my sisters to all sleep together in the lounge room. And I was so scared. We were scared. We were crying. And the biggest thing that scared me about it was that it was something that was so big that I, as a child, couldn't stop. I couldn't control. I actually couldn't even run away if I wanted to. And the safest thing for me and my family to do was to stay where we are inside the house and stay together. And even that wasn't really saving our lives. And I remember my mum bringing us together and helping calm us down by saying a prayer, and, you know, telling us to just pray and to calm us down. And I don't know how, but that night we were able to fall asleep through all of that noise, because my mum was there to, you know, I felt like I was being protected. And I also remember her telling us, you know, if she was injured, or, you know, if she wasn't around, like how to prepare and how to hide from the bombs. You know, if the bombs and the sirens for the bombings were to start, you know, like hiding under the table, or, you know, hiding under the stairs. Like I remember crouching with my mothers and my sisters under the stairs one of those nights, because the impact increased, and it was just really, really scary, and the bombs were really, really close. And look, as bad as that was, we really wanted to persevere, and we wanted to stay in our country, and we wanted to stay amongst family and friends. So even that constant bombing and absolute fear that we were going to lose our lives didn't stop us from wanting to stay amongst family and wanting to stay in our home country. But we decided to move somewhere else, and we became what is known as internally displaced people. So almost half of the population of the refugees worldwide is internally displaced, and that's when they can't be refugees outside their country, but they are refugees within their country. These are people who often don't have as many rights to seek asylum elsewhere, because in order to be a refugee, you actually have to be outside your country. But these people are still displaced, and don't have a home or protection, and do need it. So we became internally displaced people for a few months before we had to escape from Iraq. And when we did escape, we went to Jordan, which is a neighboring country to Iraq. And I remember the decision to leave Baghdad and to leave Iraq was made overnight. You know, I remember my mum saying, "Okay, girls, we're gonna pack up, and we're going to be leaving like in the middle of the night tonight, to go to leave Iraq, and we're going to go see your dad." And she was just saying really positive things, obviously, to keep us kids really calm. Saying, "We're going to go see your father, we're going to go see your dad." But there was no, we were actually just going to run away. We weren't going to go see my dad. That wasn't the plan. And I remember her packing us up, putting all of the things that we could take, like a few clothes. And I remember having just a few hours to call my friends from school on the home phone and saying, "Hi, I'm going to go on a trip. I don't know when I'll be back," and just saying bye to them. And I went that day to see my grandmother, and I thought, I'm only going to see her, I'm going to see her again, this is only going to be a short trip. And I went to see her, and I said, "Hi, Grandma, Mum's saying that we're going to go on a trip today, and we're going to go see my dad. But I just wanted to say bye to you, and I'll see you when I get back. It shouldn't be long, and things will change, and we'll be able to come back soon." And my whole family was thinking that we would be able to go back to Iraq, and that we were only going to go on a short trip. But that wasn't the case. And I never saw my grandmother again. And eventually my grandmother did pass away, and I never got to see her. And I thought that I would see her again, and that it would only be temporary, and that we would only come or need to be in Australia or in Jordan for a short period of time. But actually, I never saw her again, and that was the last time I was able to say something to her, which really, really hurts me, because I was really close with my grandma. So I remember my mum putting us in the car, and we drove to Jordan, which is a neighboring country to Iraq. And we drove in the middle of the night, and we had the lights turned off in the car so that the Americans and all the fighting wouldn't see us and think that we were dangerous and shoot at us. So it was really scary to drive during that time. And I imagine what it was for. I imagine how it was like for my mother, who had to drive 3 kids at night, who were also all really, really scared. But we drove out to Jordan. We eventually made it into Jordan, and that's when we started our journey to apply to come to Australia. So eventually we arrived in Australia after 2 months of being in Jordan. So we were really, 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 really lucky that my dad was here, and we were able to reunite with him on a family reunion visa, and we were able to come here. Even when we got to Australia, we thought that we would be able to go back to Iraq, and that things will actually get better, but they obviously didn't. And I remember arriving in Australia, and I was, a young I had just turned 11 because it was like December, it was Christmas time, it was New Year's, and I remember seeing all the beautiful lights, the celebration, the Christmas trees. And, you know, in Iraq, we celebrate Christmas, but not to the same extent. Like the whole country, the whole city was celebrating. It was just so beautiful to see Australia like that, and to have that beautiful introduction to Australia. And much like Melton, we were actually settled in Dandenong, which is, as you would know, is a very diverse suburb in Melbourne. And I think about my classroom, and there were kids from all over the world in my class. Like there were kids from Serbia, Albania, the Congo, Iran, and me and my sisters. And I fit right in. I felt like I really, really belonged. You know, I didn't speak English. I didn't know how to talk to people. I didn't know how to make friends. But the thing is, people were from all over the world. You know, there were kids from all over the world who found a home in Australia, who found a home in Melbourne, and who were all refugees, you know, who were all kids who were either migrants or refugees who had nowhere else to go, but they found a home and they found a sense of belonging here in Melbourne, in Australia. So that's when I felt like I fit right in, and I felt like I really belonged amongst a diverse community here in Melbourne. I do want to move on to talking a little bit about some of the things that we could learn from my journey, from any refugee journey that's occurring at the moment. You know, I think about how refugees today, you know, they can't see family. Like if you're a refugee who's not in their country, seeing your family is almost impossible. And I've met people who might live in Australia or live in a different country who are not allowed to travel to see their family because that would affect their application, or their family still lives back home. Like for my dad, he was never able to come and see us at all because that would put his life in danger and put us in danger as well. Like he would be picked up and killed, and we would be killed with him if he was to come and see us. And I think about people now and how, you know, we're stuck where we can't see family and friends. But I also remind myself that what I went through when I was 10 years old and what I went through when I was 5 years old is nothing what I'm going through now is nothing compared to what I went through when I was 5 years old and when I was 10 years old, because my life and my family's life was in direct danger back then, whereas now I have access to so many other options. And yes, it's so hard. It's really hard for me to not be able to go out and see my friends or see family as much as I used to. But there are other options, you know, I can call them, I can see them like on the computer, like I'm seeing you now. And you know, there are other ways, and I continue, like whenever I feel like, oh, I'm just like, we're stuck at home, we can't do this and we can't do that, I remind myself of how lucky I am at the moment and how I'm actually able to have a whole heap of other options in my life that I didn't have when I was 5 years old or when I was 10 years old, when seeing my family would actually result in them or me being murdered, which is completely different to what we're experiencing now. The other thing that I think about is impacts to work and to study. You know, when we were refugees in Jordan, it was a very short time, but I missed out on schooling. Like I didn't go to school for about 3 months, and neither did my sisters. But there are people in refugee camps at the moment who've been there for 5 years, who've been there for 7 years, for 10 years, or some kids that have been born in refugee camps. And they don't have access to go to normal schools. They don't have access to having a normal education in a classroom. You know, the best outcomes that they might have are like makeshift classrooms in refugee camps. And that's happening at the moment. That's happening right now. And that's one of the things that we have to remember, is that we're actually really, really lucky. And it's hard. I know it's hard. but because I'm experiencing it as well, you know, I have to work from home, I can't see my colleagues, I can't be in the office, but I'm really lucky to have access to technology, to have access to a job, to have access to safety, to be able to still exercise those things. Whereas there are people and children in refugee camps who can't. You know, I do think of the parents who have to homeschool their kids in the last couple of weeks, and I don't have any children, but I can only imagine how hard it is to juggle. But at the end of the day, we are still lucky to be in a country and in a community that's supportive of that. And if one of my takeaway messages today, I mean, if there's anything that we could learn from what we're going through with the current crisis, is that whatever refugees do, we would do. You know, whatever choices they make to, you know, escape or to get out of the current situation that they're in, we would have done the same thing. Like, we would have, if we were in their place, we would have done the same thing by, you know, getting our children to safety, or, you know, putting our lives at risk in a tiny boat just so that we could have a chance at a better and a safer life. And the big thing, I know it's small, but the big thing that makes me think about that is when, you know, early this year, when people started packing or you know, buying a lot of items to hoard in their houses because they were worried about supply of food and cleaning products and other items in the house. You know, I think about the time that my mum prepared our house for war, and that's also what she did. You know, she bought a lot of rice and cans of beans and all of that stuff that we knew that we weren't going to have access to. So that's the biggest thing that makes me think, actually, if people who, like the people in my community now in Australia, had they been with me back in 2003 in Iraq, they would have acted and behaved and reacted in the same way. And that's one of the big things that I want the audience to take away today, is that you would do the same thing as a refugee family. And I want this time to give us the chance to offer the empathy that we could be offering to refugees all over the world, because we would do the same thing if we were in their shoes. And the only reason that we're not in their shoes is that we were born here, or we were able to migrate here. So we're lucky, and that's something that we need to remember. The final thing I want to say in my talk is the biggest thing that got me and my family through what we went through. And even though I was a child, like, I think about, how did I get through this when I was 10 years old? You know, I whenever I look at a 10-year-old child, I think, you know, wow, they're actually really young. You know, I was really young. I don't know how I got through it. I don't know how I had the strength to be able to continue through it. And a big thing that did get me through it upon reflection is having hope. Hope being the biggest value, the biggest feeling, and the biggest trigger to keeping on going. And that's the thing that got me through everything that I went through back in 2003. Because if I didn't hope for a better life, if I didn't hope for a better tomorrow, if I didn't hope that things were going to get better for me and my family, I wouldn't have been able to mentally survive the situation. And that's one thing that I want people to also walk away with, is to have hope, because that's the only thing that's going to get us through this. And hope is the biggest antidote to fear. And we're all living in fear right now. We're all feeling in uncertainty, and having hope is a big thing that's going to get us through uncertain times. So if you learn anything from my story, it's that the 10-year-old girl got through what she got through because she was hopeful for a better life, and she was hopeful for safety, and she was able to eventually have that. So I hope that you join me on the journey of hope for a better tomorrow after the current crisis ends.
Thank you for that. We would now like to take the last 15 minutes for a Q&A session. We have received questions from the community prior to this recording, which I will now ask. Who's been your biggest inspiration in life?
Probably someone I spoke to about in my speech, which is my mum. I know people say that all the time, you know, their mum was their inspiration, but you know, the amount of strength that she's shown to me and to my sisters, you know, and through getting us through the most difficult times of our lives, that's what really inspires me. You know, it's because of my mum that I can stand up today and talk so confidently and be able to speak about my experience, and to talk so bravely in front of people about what I went through. And I do attribute that to her. I'm going to say in second person, I'm inspired by my first teacher in Australia. So when I got to Australia, I went into grade 6, and my teacher, her name is Mrs. Sirachi. I hope she's watching. She was someone who really supported me, and I didn't speak any English whatsoever, and I really struggled when I first started school because I didn't understand what people were saying and doing, but she supported me so much. She stayed back during her breaks to help me with my reading of English. She kept pushing me. She believed in me all the way. And I attribute a lot of my success to the times that she spent with me in the classroom. And I actually caught up with Mrs. Sirachi about 6 months ago, and we had coffee, and we laughed and we cried, and it was so nice to see her again. But it's someone like her who's made my experience and my transition into life in Australia really beautiful, and I felt a great sense of belonging because of her as well. Yeah.
What's your advice to younger people who are once in your shoes?
That's an interesting one. You know, I think about what kind of advice would I give to a young person or to my younger self. And, you know, at some of the hardest times when I didn't speak English, when I thought I was never going to become who I am today, like I never thought that I would become a lawyer. I never thought that I would have a speaking tour and talk to people about my story. I never thought that I would get to do a TED Talk. I never thought I would get to go to the UN and tell my story to people from all over the world. But I did those things. And you have to be able to believe in your abilities and believe in yourself. Because I met a lot of people in my life who didn't believe in me. You know, I had beautiful teachers, but I also had teachers who thought that I wasn't going to become anything, and who told me that they didn't think I was very smart and that I shouldn't be in their classroom. I had that said to me, but had I listened to that and had I listened to those teachers, I wouldn't believe in myself, you know. And I think it's important to believe in you and in your abilities, because there are people who won't, because for whatever reason it's on them, it doesn't reflect on you. But you will meet people in your life who will not believe in you, who will not support you, and the only thing that's going to keep you strong and keep you going is actually you believing in yourself and you believing in your abilities. You can do it. You know, I look back at how did this 10-year-old girl become who I am today, and my advice to her and to other young people is believe in you, surround yourself with people that support you and that love you, and have hope that things will continue to improve. And yeah, again, believe in yourself, believe in yourself, believe in yourself.
What advice would you have for the Melton community who will be rebuilding after the coronavirus pandemic?
Yep. Connect as a community, and work together as a community and support each other as a community. I think that some of the hardest times could be, like, we could get through them together, and that's when we need each other. And especially because we have been so apart for so long in the last couple of weeks. I think just uniting, coming together with your community to rebuild. You know, some of the things that I've started reflecting on during this pandemic is like issues like climate change. You know, we haven't paid attention to how we treat the environment, and you know, we haven't given as much attention to our local parks, to our local shopping centres, to our local cafes and to our local restaurants. But this pandemic has put us in a position where we started shopping locally and going to, you know, the local grocer and to local cafes to buy stuff. And I think that's really, like, that's a really big takeaway, is that what we have locally and amongst our community is really special, and I want us to continue to build that and to continue in supporting each other in that way as well. So yeah, again, a big issue that we haven't reflected on has been climate change, and I think that it's such an important issue going forward. You know, we started thinking about it when the bushfires happened early this year, but it's still an issue. And yes, we're going through a global crisis, but the climate change is a much bigger crisis for all of us. So I want us to think about that, but have to think about the people in your community who are of migrant and refugee backgrounds, who at this time might be separated from their families even more than you are, because their families might be overseas or might not be citizens, so they can't come to Australia as much. Think about these people in your community, because they do exist. You know, Melton is really diverse, and these people are in your community. And I've been to Melton many times and I have met them. They're a part of your community. Go out and try and meet them and try and support the people who are most vulnerable in your community. So it is about rebuilding. It's about coming together. It's about supporting each other, supporting your locals, and trying to think of the bigger picture that's bigger than us, people who are suffering all over the world, and our beautiful planet.
The webinar is now coming to a close, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Gary and Fadak for their words. We thank you, the community, for listening to our session today, and we hope you learned something from it. I'd like to leave you again with the important message from Nelson Mandela that education is the most important weapon you can use to change the world.